Introducing the Anbernic RG405M, a new 4-inch retro handheld with an all-metal shell in what is looking to be the first of a new wave of retro handhelds that will be continuing to use the UNISOC T618, which is becoming the go-to chipset for devices in this price range. Anbernic is no stranger to creating handhelds with an all-metal build, and we have seen this in multiple models of theirs. For Anbernic, this is their second attempt at creating a handheld with the UNISOC T618, and the first time they've decided to go all-metal with it. So has Anbernic's various iterations led them down to a path of refinement, or does the RG405M find itself being smelted into something better? Join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we once again journey with the UNISOC T618 and discover what it can do in its new form. Just like we always do, specs are up first, and let's get to know this RG405M, which is equipped with a 4-inch IPS touchscreen at a resolution of 640 by 480. It is powered by the UNISOC Tiger T618 with 2 A75 cores running at 2 GHz and 6 A55 cores at 2 GHz with the Mali G52 GPU at 850 MHz. It comes with 4 GB of LPDDR4X RAM, and 128 GB of eMMC internal storage with the ability to expand using the micro SD slot supporting up to 2 TB. It supports USB Type-C for data and charging only, with no video out capabilities, Wi-Fi 802.11ac, Bluetooth 5.0, and a 4500 mAh battery that Anbernic claims will provide an average of 7 hours of battery life. It ships with Android 12 out of the box, and will be available for purchase starting March 28th on AliExpress at Anbernic's official website at an early bird price of $167.99 US for the standard version and a regular price of $177.99 US. Time for our usual unboxing, and this unit was sent to me by Anbernic for the purpose of this review. They didn't require anything of me, and the device simply showed up with a spec sheet provided by them. Anbernic has not seen this video prior to publishing. Okay, so you can see that we get our customary no-frills Anbernic package with very minimal art on the box. I will say that this package is very compact, and Anbernic is definitely getting better at keeping things to the absolute minimum. Let's peek inside and take a look at what comes with the Anbernic RG405M, our usual foamy overlay to protect the most crucial elements of the handheld. It makes for a pretty good frisbee as well. We will gently set aside the main attraction and dig deeper into the package to see what other goodies await. Again, this is pretty standard Anbernic fare. We get the wet and dry wipes, a micro SD card, and some other goodies. Here is the RG405M instruction sheet, and these are decent for referencing some commands and giving you a general overview of the features. Nothing too thrilling here. The included screen protector, a USB-C to Type-A cable, and finally back to the main attraction. Okay, baggy undone, and let's gently reveal the new Anbernic RG405M. You can see that the colorway I received was their gray, which definitely has very green undertones. I'm really digging this color. I think it's quite attractive and different than some of the other colors we see out there. I have to say that just initially in my hands, everything really feels nice and premium. So let's begin our tour of the device. Starting with the top left, and you can see the inline shoulder buttons, which is quite common for most of these Anbernic devices. The R1 and R2 buttons are pressed down nicely, and not really noticing any issues here. You can see that the R2 is slightly raised, again a very standard Anbernic thing at this point. Moving alongside the top, you can see our power button, volume up and down, the USB-C port for data and charging only. There is no video out functionality on this device, an indicator light, exhaust vent, and finally the L2 and L1 inline shoulder buttons, and just like on the right side, everything is pressing down nicely here. Alright, moving alongside the left of the device, nothing to note here. And finally down to the bottom of the unit, and you can see the downward firing stereo speakers, the 3.5mm port for headphones, and the micro SD expansion slot. And moving along to the right again, nothing to note here. Let's check out the backside, and you can see that Anbernic has put their textured rubber grippy pads, which have been seen on quite a few of their devices, and I do really like when they do this. It just makes things a lot easier to grip when you're holding the handle, especially one that is all metal like this. Okay, let's move back to the front left and check out the Hall effect analog stick. the very Anbernic D-pad, which is easily one of the better ones in these retro handheld devices, and then the home and back button for Android navigation. Looking at how the analog stick and D-pad sit above the face of the unit, you can see that the analog stick is fairly flush with the front and sits quite low, making this very compact. The D-pad has nice movement and travel. You can see that pressing down is quite thunky and satisfying. It presses down nicely on the edges, and it doesn't have the greatest pivot to me, but it's not mushy to press down on either. Overall, it's really nice. On the right front side, you can see our buttons are arranged in the Nintendo style with the BAYX configuration, the right Hall effect analog stick, and then the start and select buttons. Okay, turning on to the side to see how the face buttons sit above the device. The Anbernic buttons and setup are just about the best in the business in terms of retro handhelds. To me, they have just the right amount of travel, they sit above the face of the device, and they are also satisfying to press down on and just again feel right. Okay, let's power on this handheld for the first time and run through whatever setup process there may be. Once you get past the welcome screen, the system will go on to do its thing, and this process does take a few minutes, so I will speed up through this and get to the next step. Okay, welcome to the Android main screen, and the nice thing about this build is that it's very vanilla with just some emulators preloaded. This does have Google Play Store pre-installed, and it's great to see that Anbernic is learning from their experiences with Android. Alright, so continuing the tour of the Android experience with the RG405M, there are some things worth talking about that Anbernic keeps in the quick access portion of Android. So first, you can see we have the ability to toggle the CPU to run its high performance setting. Now in my testing, I didn't really notice this having any effect on anything, but I just want to show what's here. There's also the ability to toggle from the Nintendo Switch mode to the Xbox mode, and what this does is switch the button configuration to mimic either the Nintendo style or Xbox style setup. Here's a quick look at the built-in key mapper, which is accessible from here. We will be returning to this in more detail shortly, and finally the option to turn on Anbernic's game mode, which is their front-end launcher for Android. This is something that they seem to be making improvements on. Personally, I find it to be not all that exciting, and there are better options available on Android. Regardless, it is still nice to see that Anbernic is trying to improve on their overall out-of-the-box experience. You can see that we have a couple of themes and styles that we can use here. When you're in the console of choice, pressing select will let you configure a few settings, such as specifying which emulator to use and setting game paths for the launcher to scan. Alright, enough of that, let's talk about the build quality for a moment. Again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, everything feels very nice in the hands. It's definitely got a premium feeling build. There's obviously not going to be any kind of flexing with a device like this. It's really just in a different class when compared to its plastic counterparts. Now checking out the finishing of the metal, it's mostly smooth and finished nicely. I did manage to find one spot where it was slightly noticeable where the back plate meets with the body. Again, outside of that bottom right corner, all the seams seem to line up nicely and everything is very smooth. Let's talk a little bit about the display now. It's a fairly low resolution display coming in at only 640 by 480, but again for the purposes of consuming 4x3 content with emulation up to about Gamecube and PS2, this is actually not a terrible resolution to have here. However, Android is clearly not optimized for a low resolution display anymore, and it's obvious when navigating within the Android system. For emulation purposes, this is not an issue at all. The display itself is IPS, so we get the solid viewing angles and the image won't wash out. I did find the display to be a bit dimmer than I'm used to, and going from 100% brightness to about 50% brightness gives you a very dim display, almost to the point that I never use it at this setting in normal indoor settings. However, I know that many will use this device in a dark room before bed, and this device gets down to about the absolute darkest that I have seen on any device of this kind. In fact, I had to turn down my studio lights to really show on camera just how dark the display can get, which for some of my viewers will be amazing, as their partner will no longer be upset with them gaming with an ultra bright screen in bed. Now I wanted to show the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus here as a comparison so I can try to give you a good sense of the differences in terms of brightness scaling between the devices. So you can see what the RG405M looks like at 50% brightness compared to the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which I think is quite apparent on camera. At 100%, the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus is definitely brighter in person than the RG405M. Part of the disparity here is that the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus clearly scales very differently with its brightness settings, and so I just wanted to demonstrate the differences between the two implementations. I think the RG405M has much better scaling, with the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus ultimately having a brighter panel. Personally, I like to keep my Retroid Pocket 3 Plus at around that 50% brightness setting, but for the RG405M, I'm finding myself going closer to the upper end indoors in a normal daytime lit room. I also wanted to mention quickly that the face buttons Anbernic are using a technique known as double shot injection molding, which is definitely nice from the standpoint of durability. The lettering, for example, will not just simply scrape off or wear, and so this is a nice touch to see. I'll leave it to you, the viewer, to decide if the glossy Skittles style is a good look for the device. And then there's the D-pad, so let's talk a little more about it. As I mentioned earlier, this is a pretty standard D-pad for Anbernic devices, and if you are familiar with them, you pretty much know what to expect here. Now, of course, this is something I get asked about all the time with other devices, and so here's a quick test of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 on Dreamcast, and you can see that I'm able to hit the combo with consistency. It's definitely one of the better D-pads I have used, and additionally, I am not finding its placement on this device to be much of an issue. I think that both the analog and D-pad are positioned just so that their reach on the device is pretty comfortable for either setup. And finally, the Hall effect analog sticks, and I wanted to quickly show the dead zones and sensitivity, which seems to be quite on point here. You can see that Anbernic has this set up to fill that range in the corners, which is the ideal setup for an emulation-focused handheld. Moving along, and let's size up the RG405M and check it out against some other devices. You can see I have a spread of some of the handhelds that will be joining us today for this part of the video. And first up, let's size up the Anbernic devices with the RG505 on the bottom and the RG353M at the top. And let's check out the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus in comparison, and one more Retroid device with the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus. And now let's size up the current crop of T618 devices with the POW Kitty X18S, RG405M, Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, and finally the RG505. And lastly, for fun, here is a device most are familiar with and the original Nintendo Switch compared against the RG405M. Alright, let's take some numbers for weight, and you can see that the RG405M comes in at about 263 grams or a little over 9 ounces. The other Anbernic T618 device, the RG505, coming in at a little over 10 ounces or 287 grams. The Retroid Pocket 3 Plus at 236 grams or a little over 8 ounces. The clamshell POW Kitty X18S at almost 11 ounces or 308 grams. And another metal device from Anbernic with the RG353M coming in at 231 grams or a little over 8 ounces. So you can see that the RG405M is slightly heavier despite the screen only being slightly larger. The Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, which comes under 7 ounces or a little under 200 grams, and I completely forgot just how light this handheld actually is. Finally, the Nintendo Switch at just shy of 400 grams or 14 ounces with those Joy-Cons attached. Looking at the 405M and the 353M from a different angle, and it does appear that they are quite similar in thickness. Let's take a caliper to this and get an actual measurement, and you can see that the 405M is about 16mm thick, whereas the 353M is just slightly thinner at around 15.3mm. Here is the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus at about 14mm. Okay, let's take some measurements of the face buttons, and these definitely seem to be standard Anbernic sized buttons, and they are about 7.5mm in diameter, with the analog stick appearing to be around 14.5mm, compared to the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, which definitely has smaller face buttons at 6.5mm and a smaller analog stick cap at about 13.5mm. Unsurprisingly, the RG353M shares a similar sized face button with its 405M counterpart, likewise for the analog stick. We will be checking out the face buttons one more time in the upcoming teardown. And speaking of teardowns, let's just do this thing right now. So the back plate is held on with 4 screws that will require a 1.5mm hex bit that I will use for my trusty iFixit kit. So let's quickly get these 4 screws removed. I just want to comment quickly that I was very impressed by the quality of the screws being used here. They're definitely beefier than what you usually see. Okay, back to the fast motion. Alright, now we can finally free the backplate from the rest of the device. You can immediately feel the heft that comes with this being an all-metal device. Just looking at the machining that's been done on this, and again, Anbernic is doing a really nice job with these metal handhelds. So here's a nice centered look at the internals of the RG405M. And now a little bit of a closer look of the components. Alright, now time to remove the shielding to further work our way down. You will need to switch to a standard Phillips screwdriver for this portion as it's held on with 3 tiny screws. Okay, with the shielding off, you can see how the backplate is designed to even accommodate the specific aspect of the design. Alright, now we can take a look at the battery that is included with this device. You can see that we do have that 4500 mAh battery, which is definitely pretty beefy for a device of this size. I will also say that I really do appreciate just how easy it is to get down to this point to do a battery replacement if needed. Here's a look at the Hall effect analog sticks, and again, another component that is easily replaceable. Alright, so I'd like to remove the mainboard so I can take a look at the face buttons on this device. Gently lifting the tabs on the motherboard and freeing the cables, this is a pretty precarious position, so if you are wanting to do this, just be pretty careful when trying to free the ribbon cables. Okay, with that done, let's focus on getting this analog stick out of here. As is pretty standard for these units, the ribbon cable is very delicate and tiny, so just carefully lift the tab and then free the ribbon cable. I personally use my fingers for that last step as I don't think I trust myself enough with another tool. The analog stick is held on with 2 standard screws, so let's quickly get that removed. The nice thing about the analog stick is that it's completely separate from the main board, so if you were wanting to do a replacement, this is essentially the steps needed. I definitely appreciate the design here, as I've seen cases where the analog stick is just buried under other components and screws. Alright, now time to get this main board out of here. These are again using standard screws, so no need to change your bit. The speaker will need to be taken out, which has to be done as it is screwed in with the main board. Okay, finally all the screws are out and we can get to this main board now. Here is a nice close-up of the front and back. So let's take a look at the face buttons, which is actually for my own selfish purposes for doing this teardown. You can see the membrane here, and the skittle buttons are peeking right through it. Here's a closer look at the membrane being used here. And finally, a look at the double shot injection molded face buttons. Now I said I had selfish reasons for doing this, and well, you can see that the RG353M and 405M appear to have similar sized face buttons. Again, these are pretty standard for Anbernic, so behind the scenes I decided to take apart my 353M and borrow its buttons to place in my 405M. And of course, it wasn't much of a surprise, but they do fit perfectly in the shell of the 405M, and so I will move forth and reassemble my 405M with these in place of the original Skittles setup. And here is the reveal of the 405M with its new digs. Personally, I think the 353M buttons look great on this device. Now, it may not pop as much as the original setup, but I do think it fits in with the aesthetics of the design better, with everything else kind of having that matte finish. But yeah, you can see no issues with it and it works great, so if you are curious, there's a good chance that most of the Anbernic's devices with 4 face buttons are easily swappable into this. So what do you think? Should I keep this setup or return the 405M to its stock setup with these Skittles buttons? Let me know down in the comments. Alright, so despite the 405M containing the UNISOC T618, which at this point is a pretty well-known quantity, I thought about what is a potential competitor to it in its size and around its price point. Now this is also good for someone who may not know much about the T618, and still I think it's worth talking about here. You can see up first with synthetic benchmarking that I have Antutu here, and I decided to compare the 405M to Anbernic's own 353 devices, which have Android support using that ROC chip 3566, and another device that, if it is able to launch, could be a solid option to consider with the KTR1 powered by the Helio G99. Now I have a Helio G99 device on hand, and so the numbers are based on that device, but it should give us a good indication of what to expect here with the KTR1. You can see that the Helio G99 is definitely providing more performance, and again, based on the entry price of the KTR1, could be a very good option to consider with the size of the screen, aspect ratio, and dimensions of the device. However, the 405M will be a readily available option, and Anbernic is quite good at maintaining supply. Next up we have Geekbench 6, and I was unable to include the RK3566 in this since the test would stop working at around 65% despite trying multiple times. However, you can see how the T618 lines up against the Helio G99. And finally, the 3D Mark Wildlife test, and you can see that the T618 is right in the middle between the RK3566 devices and the Helio G99, which does offer nearly a 67 performance increase over the T618. I will quickly comment that unsurprisingly, the UNISOC T618 is an exceptionally stable chip when it comes to thermal performance, and it really does quite well in that department. And of course, here is some battery testing with higher end emulation on the left side, and I thought I'd give Kratos a break from spinning around and instead torture Link this time around. So on the left we have Gamecube emulation with Dolphin playing Wind Waker, and at 100% brightness, 75% volume, Wi-Fi on, you can see that the battery life was around 4.5 hours, which is quite nice for a device of this size. Now on the opposite end of the spectrum, as I usually do for my lighter test, here is Yoshi's Island at 50% brightness, 50% volume, no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, and the device managed over 18 hours of on-screen time. That's really incredible performance. Finally, I will comment that the device took about 3.5 hours to charge using a standard 5V 2A adapter from 0 to 100%. Now for my final test, and this one was interesting to me because despite the device feeling warm at times to hold, it does appear that the metal build is allowing the heat to be dispersed evenly and effectively. I left the device on with Genshin Impact, which is definitely a good way to heat up your device, and surprisingly, I never noted temperatures above 33 degrees Celsius. I kept having my own doubts about it and tested it again doing multiple runs of the Wildlife Extreme stress test, and again the numbers were never going above that temperature range. So the metal will obviously respond to your environment, so for a cooler ambient temperature, the device will feel cooler to your hands, and the same goes for a warmer environment. Regardless, I do think that heat dispersion is quite good, and I don't think the device will get to the point that it is too hot to handle despite its metal chassis. Alright, so let's get into the fun part and actually play some games on this handheld. First, I'll talk about native Android gaming, and for longtime viewers of the channel, you will know that I'm quite the big supporter of native Android gaming, having covered the topic multiple times here, and I definitely recommend checking out some of those videos if you are looking for some ideas of great games to get from the Play Store. So the nice thing about native Android games is that a lot of them will actually scale properly to a 4:3 aspect ratio. For example, you can see I have Horizon Chase running here, and this was a game that I actually used to play a lot on my Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, so it's one I'm quite familiar with on a lower resolution 4:3 panel. It's a good example of a native Android game that does scale properly. Of course, this might not be true for every game on the market. Now here's Turnip Boy Commits Tax Evasion, and I think this is the first time I've actually mentioned the game here on the channel, and this game did receive a solid Android port. Now finally, I know what you're thinking, really? Dead Cells again? But this is actually an important one because as I mentioned, a lot of Android games will scale properly to this 4:3 lower resolution screen. However, Dead Cells is a good example of an outlier that will require you to carefully navigate the menu to turn on the high resolution mode. Otherwise, you will never be able to read the text in game. So from the title screen, go down to the second option, which is Options, and then in the Options screen, scroll down to the third option, which is the Video Settings, and finally go down to the second choice, which will allow you to toggle high resolution mode. Now you can see that with the adjustment, the text is now a lot easier to read than before. Now this is a great example of an Android port done right, and many know just how much I love this game. I will talk a little bit more about some Android issues with Anbernic's implementation a little later that does have to do with Dead Cells. And finally, I wanted to show the key mapping in-game. So first, I'll of course show Genshin Impact. Now I wanted to use this game because Anbernic's Gamepad Mapper actually has a profile defined for this already. So when you bring up the Keypad Mapper and head over to the Config Manager, you can see that there is an option for Genshin Impact. So selecting Use, and you can see how the buttons are placed to match up with the interface of Genshin Impact. So hit the switch toggle and let's test this out. And yeah, you can see how this is all mapped out nicely so you don't need to spend a lot of time tweaking. Now let's say there is a game that doesn't have a profile already available. Well, I will use Absolute Drift as a demonstration for the keypad mapping. So you can see that this game doesn't have any native controller support, but let's take a moment and get this all set up. So bringing up the Gamepad Mapper, the first thing you will want to do before making any changes to it is go into Config Manager and then set up a new config by selecting that option at the top. Once you've done that, you can scroll down to the new config and select Use. You can see how it's switched to a default setup, and now we can start to tweak this new configuration. The first thing I usually like to do is rename it to something obvious. I usually just go with the name of the game. You can see now that it's coming up as Absolute Drift in the Config Manager list. So let's configure the button mapping. For this, I usually like to turn off all of the inputs and then add as needed. You can see that selecting the X next to whatever input will turn off the input. So let's quickly turn off all of these. So I like using an analog stick for this game, so I will enable the left analog, and now you can see the icon appears on screen. I will move it over and position it just so that the left and right are centered between the two inputs. You can see that it's a bit small, so we can then go ahead and adjust the scale of the left stick, move it on over, and this should work out pretty well. Now I'd like to add in my acceleration and braking inputs, so let's go ahead and enable B and Y and place them on screen. Now there are a few other inputs that we could add for this game, but let's go ahead and test at this point. Make sure to hit save on the config and select switch at top, and we should be good to go. So yeah, everything is working as expected, and again, you can go back and tweak as necessary and add whatever you'd like. In this case, I'd probably need to set the drift icon and probably set something for the pause screen. And with that, it's time to move on to the bread and butter of this device, and that is emulation. First, I will showcase the 5th generation and beyond on here, as everything prior to that should work on here with the T618, and the 4:3 aspect ratio is a nice balance for those older consoles. Now first up is the Gameboy Advance, and that doesn't use a 4:3 aspect ratio, and so you will get very small black bars at the top and bottom, but the 405M will be a nice way to play some of these games. You can see that I have Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure running, and the one thing I absolutely loved about the Game Boy Advance generation was that it was always interesting to see how developers adapted games found on consoles like the PlayStation 2 to work with the Game Boy Advance's limited hardware. So with Crash Bandicoot, they actually turned it into more of a traditional platformer, but with all the charm of Crash Bandicoot. I actually really love this one. Now here's another game that was adapted to the Game Boy Advance in a very different way than its home console counterparts. Medal of Honor Infiltrator resembles something like Commando from the arcades with its top-down running gun style gameplay, instead of the first-person shooter that we've come to expect from the franchise. This one again is kind of a neat game that I don't hear mentioned all that much. Finally, I think Shem from Retro Breeze will be quite happy with my inclusion of Sonic Battle, and this one is a very cool showcase of some of the Game Boy Advance's 3D chops, and it's a fun game at that. I mean seriously, haven't you just wanted to punch Tails in the face? I know Sonic has. Alright, now moving on to a console that just doesn't seem to get any respect. The Sega Saturn is definitely one of my personal favorites, and I will admit, if you give me anything Sega, I will probably fanboy with the best of them. The Saturn has always been one of my personal favorite consoles to collect for and experiment with. So you can see that Sega Rally Championship is running very nicely here, and it looks so great on this 4:3 screen. In fact, the two consoles I've been playing quite a bit on here have been Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. And next up is probably one of the finest shmups ever created, and from the masterminds at Treasure comes Radiant Silvergun. This is another great game that works very well here. One last Saturn game to round things out, and Nights into Dream is another one of those iconic Sega Saturn games. Moving on to the land of Nintendo, here is some Super Mario 64, and to no surprise, it's working great. Again, content like Nintendo 64, PS1, Dreamcast are all going to be a very nice fit with that 4x3 display. Here's a little bit of Wave Race 64, and it just amazes me how well this one holds up. 10-year-old me was blown away by the water physics, and well, nothing really has changed today. And finally, Star Wars Rogue Squadron, and this one is looking quite nice on that 4-inch 4x3 display. And of course, we can't discuss the 5th generation without some PlayStation 1. First up is some Ridge Racer R4, which I'm hoping will be nominated for Retro Handheld's Game of the Month, since it will be a fun one to revisit. And another racing game that I've always loved on the PlayStation 1, and that is of course Crash Team Racing, and again, no issues here and looks fantastic. Finally, let's get some more shmup goodness here with R-Type Delta. So it seems appropriate to move on to the Sega Dreamcast now, and again that 4x3 display will really go well with games from this platform. I think it's obvious that the T618 has more than enough power to handle Dreamcast, so here are some different games that I wanted to spotlight briefly. You can see that I have Metropolis Street Racer, and well, before Project Gotham Racing for Xbox existed, we had this from Bizarre Creations instead. The game still looks great to this day. And here's a little Space Channel 5 Part 2, a fun rhythm game from the mind of Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who had his hands on games like Tetris Effect, Lumines, and Rez. And finally, a game that was actually a Japanese exclusive but received a fan translation back in 2019. Here is Nappletail, and this is a 2.5D style platformer kind of like Klonoa, and this one actually had a team consisting of primarily women for its creative staff. The music in particular is a standout, with it being composed by Yoko Kanno, who was responsible for music in anime such as Cowboy Bebop. Definitely give this one a shot now that it is fully playable for English speakers. Okay, before moving on to the 6th generation home consoles, I wanted to briefly talk about PlayStation Portable. Now I know that there will be some who will play PSP on here, and the T618 does a great job with PSP emulation. For me personally, I find that PSP emulation should really be done on a 16:9 device. So I will just briefly show a game here running on the 4x3 display, which will add black borders to the top and bottom, unless you stretch vertically, which is not something I personally like to do. So the 6th generation was an interesting time, since it was definitely a transition period, moving from 4x3 content to 16:9 content, but this was a generation that primarily was designed for 4x3 first, with some games supporting widescreen unless you were over on Xbox. Now the thing with Gamecube and PS2 emulation on the T618 is that you will not be able to play their entire libraries, and while a good portion of the Gamecube and PlayStation 2 library will do pretty well here, it's not perfect, and there will likewise be a good amount not playable without a significant amount of hacks. So with that being said, let's check out some PlayStation 2 first, and here I have Contra Shattered Soldier, and this one works really well with the T618. Now for something harder like God of War 2, you will need to do some tweaking to get it running as you see here. Anbernic has Ether SX2 configured out of the box with it aggressively set for underclocking, and I personally went in and changed those settings on a per game basis. Finally, Gamecube with the T618 is another well-known quantity, and so it's really just being able to enjoy Gamecube content on a nice 4-inch 4x3 display in a compact package. Again, this one will not play the entire library of Gamecube games, but a lot are quite playable. Here is some Billy Hatcher and the Giant Egg, which is a neat little game from the Sonic team. And of course some Wind Waker looking really nice on this 4x3 display. Finally, consoles like Vita, Switch, Wii will be quite limited on here. I have covered things like Switch emulation with the T618 on this channel, and again, it's just more of a preference where I like seeing 16:9 content on a 16:9 display, so I'd opt to play those consoles on something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus instead. Now, as is always the case with these handhelds, there's always some kind of fault. Now, the RG405M definitely gets a lot of things right, and for the most part is quite a great experience. But I do want to talk about Anbernic's Android build, which isn't perfect and does have some weird glitches from time to time. For example, I noticed that occasionally the device will stop detecting the built-in controls properly, and then the device starts to act really odd. A reboot will usually resolve the problem, but I have had it happen a few times to me. Another thing I've noticed is that occasionally the Android gestures will just stop working or appearing on screen. Again, this can be mitigated by using the physical button to navigate Android, but it is worth mentioning. Another really weird thing I found for my device was when I was playing games that I downloaded from the Google Play Store. For whatever reason, if I did multitasking or switched windows or went back to the home screen and then hopped back into the game, I would lose audio. This only happens with games from the Play Store, and here's a quick demonstration of what I mean. Now, I reached out to some others to verify if they had the same issue as me, and they couldn't replicate it, so I'm not sure what to make of that. It was also brought to my attention that L2-R2 functionality doesn't seem to work in native Android games. Now, I've tested this with Gamepad Tester, and the device does detect the L2 and R2 buttons, and it does seem to work properly in emulation as well as when you use the Gamepad mapping. But again, this is a weird issue that seems to be persistent across all of Anbernic's Android-based devices. For example, in Dead Cells, you cannot use L2 or R2, and so you will have to go into the game settings to remap it to something that can be detected, such as the D-pad. Now, not every game will offer that option, and so that is an issue if you are looking to play native Android games that happen to use L2 and R2. I did reach out to Anbernic regarding all of these issues I've discovered, and I'm hoping they will be able to address some of these in future updates. Finally, this is still not quite the ideal out-of-the-box experience for someone new to these devices. I noticed that a lot of the emulators were configured poorly. Personally, this isn't as big of an impact for me, as I much prefer tweaking and loading my own preferred emulators, but again, for a completely new user, this might prove to be intimidating. And as always, there are a few things to consider here. The RG405M is a really solid device for taking in 4x3 content, and if you own or owned a Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, for example, this might be a very nice upgrade coming from a device like that, which you can dedicate to your 4x3 gaming and get a little more power with a new build of Android. There are also a few T618 devices on the market now, and coming soon, such as the Retroid Pocket Flip, so when it comes to this chipset, we already know what to expect for the most part from it, and so this is really a preference as to what you are looking for. Something like the Retroid Pocket 3 Plus might be a better compromise, as you can still handle 4x3 content, but also make better use of the 16:9 display for something like PlayStation Portable emulation. And if you are a 353M user, this also might interest you, as the T618 gives you a substantial boost in power on the Android side, but you do lose out on that Linux side, which for some is a nice option to have. On its own, the 405M is probably one of the best all-around packages that Anbernic has put out, backed with an exceptional build quality and a fairly competitive price compared to the other T618 devices on the market. Ultimately, you are paying extra for that premium metal build, but it is the only option with a 4x3 display that is powered by that T618. And as I always say, it is great that we do have so many quality options today on the market for someone to find what fits their needs best. And so with that, this lengthy video is coming to an end, and I really do appreciate you sticking around to follow along with me exploring a lot of what the Anbernic RG405 has to offer. If you like what you've seen here, please consider sharing, liking, and subscribing, as it does help the channel out quite a bit, and it allows me to continue to provide these kinds of in-depth videos. I don't think it will be long before I return with yet another T618 device. As many know, Retroid has announced the Retroid Pocket Flip, and that too will have the same T618 chipset, but in a clamshell form. So what did you think about the RG405M? Is this a device you will be considering to purchase, or are you waiting for something different to come along? As always, I love reading your comments, so please do share them down below. This is the Retro Tech Dad, and I thank you so much for watching.